In this video series, I'm going to show you how you can make a magical repair effect in Unity. We're going to first create a breakable model in Blender, and after that we're going to jump straight into Unity to create this effect. Have fun! Hey, thanks for tuning in! No long intro this time, we're jumping straight into how to make a magical repair effect in Unity. So the basic idea to create this effect is that we're going to first make an object explode, and then record the movement of its parts and save them into an animation clip. Afterwards we're going to change the animation clip in a way to play the animation backwards, but with a little bit of rotation to make it a bit more magical. Okay, sounds simple enough. Now before we can start implementing this effect, we're going to need to make some preparations first. We need 1, a 3D model we want to destroy. And 2, a broken version of it, meaning the same model but broken up into smaller pieces. Now for everyone who wants to know how to create a broken version of your 3D model, I'm going to show you some ways to do it in Blender. But if you already have everything we need, or just want to go straight into the coding part, then you can skippity skip to part 2. Link is in the video description. Alright, then let's jump straight into Blender. Okay, so in Blender, let's just first delete the default cube. Good. Now you either load in your existing model, or you can create a 3D model you want to later destroy. Let me just quickly create one myself. Next, we're going to select our 3D model, go into edit mode by pressing tab, and move it a bit up so that its origin point is at the bottom of our object. Okay, now I'm going to finish up my 3D model. For that, I'm going to stretch the cube a bit by first selecting its top face, then press G to be able to move it, then Z to lock its movement to the Z axis, and then finally move it up by a meter. I did not exactly hit 1 meter, so I'm going to set it here. And that will be my 3D model for this tutorial. Oh, and if at any time you are unsure in what mode we are currently in, you can keep track by just looking up here. Okay, now let's get back to object mode by pressing tab again, and let's just quickly rename our 3D model. Now, to create the broken version of our object, we're going to first duplicate our 3D model by pressing Shift and D, and then right click so that we don't accidentally shift our duplicate to a different position. Afterwards, we select the duplicate we want to destroy and go into edit mode. And also hide our original 3D model so that we can focus on our duplicate. Okay, so to slice up our model, we need to define where our cuts should be. There are many ways to do this, but in this video I'm going to show you 3 tools that I use to slice up my 3D models. Let's start with the first one, the loop cut tool. The loop cut tool creates an edge loop in a loop of faces. So for example here, we can create an edge loop around the object, or here. But if our loop of faces is interrupted, for example by creating an edge here, our edge loop gets interrupted as well. Okay, let's remove that and go back to the beginning. When activating the loop cut tool, we can select the number of loops by using our scroll wheel. I'm going to choose 2 loops. Now we left click once to confirm these and choose the position of our edge loops by moving our mouse. Afterwards, we left click again to select the position. But if we just want the default position, we can instead press the right mouse key. Nice, now we have created 2 new edge loops. Now to slice up our object along these edges, we need to first select them by either shift click each individual edge, or by selecting the whole edge loop with Alt and click, and then adding the second edge loop with Shift Alt and click. And finally, by pressing V, we can cut this piece out. Let's now again press right click to set this piece to its default position. Nice, now we have 3 individual pieces. Now when hovering over a certain piece and press L, Blender will select all the faces of this individual piece. But watch out! Pressing L will not only select all the faces of an individual piece, but it will add this selection to the current selection. Meaning that when you already have selected a face on another piece and press L on this individual piece, the selected face from before will stay in the selection, and that can lead to unwanted behavior. Therefore, it is always best to first unselect everything by clicking at an empty space and then select your piece. Okay, with that out of the way, let's continue. Now let's first focus on the middle piece. For that, I'm going to hide the other pieces by first selecting the piece I want to hide and then press H to hide it. Now we only have our middle piece visible, but we see one big problem here. The piece has a big hole in it because our 3D model is basically hollow. So let's fix that. To do that, we just select all the edges of one gap and press F to create a new face and close the gap. Now let's also do this for the other side. And now we have a real chunk of our 3D model. Now let's also fill the gap of the other pieces. For that, we need to unhide them first by pressing Alt and H and select the middle piece and hide it instead. And we do the same gap closing process we did with the other pieces. And voila! Now we have 3 real pieces of our original model. But 3 pieces are not enough, so I'm going to slice them into even more pieces. So let's focus first on the bottom piece. Now we are not done with our loop cut tool yet. After we've created a new loop cut, for example like this, and before pressing V to actually cut our piece out, we can further customize our cut, for example by selecting one edge of our loop cut and move it along the face by pressing G twice. Pressing G twice instead of only once allows us to move our edge in this example without changing the shape of our object. And we can not only do this with edges, but also with vertices. We just select the vertex we want to move, press G twice and move it along its edge without changing the shape of the piece. Okay, I said without changing the shape, but if you move a vertex that is at a corner or an edge with vertices at the corner, you will change the shape of your object, so beware. Okay, now we again select our edges and press V to finally cut our object. And don't forget to right click afterwards so that everything stays or returns to its original position. Now, before we close the gaps of faces, let me introduce to you the other tools I use to slice up my 3D models. So the second tool in our list is the Bisect tool. The Bisect tool is pretty straightforward. First we have to select everything we want to be able to bisect. Then with the Bisect tool selected, we left click, hold and drag where we want our cut to be, and finally release our mouse button to create our cut. Or the edges for our cut. And that's it. Now press V again and end it with a right click. And we have successfully separated our pieces. Okay, now to our third and final tool for today, the knife tool. With the knife tool, we can just cut out the pieces we like by just clicking a path along our model. To do that, we choose the starting point of our cut by just clicking on our object. For example here on this edge, and then click our way around the object. And when we are done cutting, for example here until I reach the starting point again, we can confirm our cut by pressing the Enter key on our keyboard. And with that, we have again successfully created a new cut. Now as always, press V, followed by a right click to separate our pieces. And that's it. Great! Now that we know how to cut our model with these tools, let me show you now how to close the gaps in these particular cases. With the Bisect tool, it is again pretty straightforward. Since we just cut out our object in a straight line and did not manipulate our edges in any way, we can just highlight all the edges of our cut, and then press F to create a face. But with our knife tool, we created a whole other situation. Since we freely cut our way through our object, if we now would highlight all the edges and press F to close the gap, we would create something called a non-planar face. But what even is a non-planar face? Simply speaking, a non-planar face is a face that has a bend. Depending on the degree of the bend, this can for example create unwanted shading behaviors, because we need a planar face to calculate our normal and determine for example how light will bounce off of that face. And since only triangles are guaranteed to be planar, our renderer will automatically split our quad or n-gon into triangles. So if we have a non-planar face, then our renderer has to simply spoken guess where the edge is to correctly determine the triangles. Is the edge maybe here? Or here, which will completely change how our object will look like. But just so you know, this here was an extreme case of a bend. If you only have a minimal bend, this will be less of an issue. But even here, it won't hurt to help our renderer out a bit. Alright, now that we all know what non-planar faces are, let's return to our project. Okay, so looking at our piece, we see a situation here where we need an edge to not bend our plane. So to do that, we have to highlight the 2 vertices where our edge should be and then press F to create an edge. So pressing F creates a face when we highlight edges and edges when we highlight vertices. And now we can start to add faces. One on this side and one on the other side. But if you look closely here, you see that this side still does not look right. It is because, you may have guessed it, this face is a non-planar face. You can see again that our face bends here. I'm going to fix it in a bit, but let us look first at our cut we created with the Loop Cut tool. With the Loop Cut tool, non-planar faces can happen, depending on the shape of your loop of faces and on if you manually move the vertices or edges of your loop cut, like I did here. But luckily, my changes are not too big of an issue, so we can just select all the edges of our cut and press F to close the gap. Okay, back to our knife tool piece. To fix our non-planar face here, we can put an edge between these two vertices. But because we already have a face here, we need to join these two by first selecting them and then press J to create an edge between them. Not F, but J. Because F would just create an edge lying on that face without splitting the face, meaning that it would still be one face. But J joins the vertices by creating an edge between them and splitting the face into two faces. Another way we can achieve this is by using the knife tool again and cut our face from one point to another. Okay, now that we have done that, we need to close the gap on the corresponding piece. So let's press Alt and H to unhide, and then hide again everything we don't need. Here it is important that we set the edges exactly like in the other piece, or else we would change the geometry and the two pieces won't really fit together. Okay, now let's just close up the two remaining faces, and we've created 4 individual pieces out of the bottom piece of this cuboid. Great, now that you know how to slice up your 3D model, you can now continue to slice up your model however you like using these techniques. I'm going to do the same, but I'm going to speed up the video until our next step. So 3, 2, 1, go! Oh hey, not really our next step, but there is something I'd like to mention. Some moments ago you saw that when I wanted to close the gaps of a piece that I hid before, I had to unhide everything and then hide each piece again until I met the piece I wanted to work on. Unfortunately, I haven't found a way in Blender to just unhide the last hidden object. And always unhiding everything with Alt and H, and then hiding again all the pieces you don't need with H is really time consuming when you have to do this a lot. So, while making this tutorial, I had an idea. Instead of hiding certain pieces, I just moved them away from each other by a specific distance. Add the faces to close the gaps, and then move them back together exactly to where they were before. And this saved me a lot of time. But if you have a better solution for this problem or have a better way to handle this, then why not write a comment down below and let everyone know. I think not only me, but also all your fellow developers will appreciate it. Okay, that's it. Now let's continue. Phew, okay, done. And it just took me too long. Okay, so we sliced up our 3D model. What we need to do now is to make an individual object out of each piece and parent all the pieces to an empty plane axis, which is like an empty object in Unity. So let's do that. In object mode, we need to first create an empty object that would hold all our pieces. I'm just gonna call it 3D model pieces. And then set it as a parent of our slice up model by first selecting our model, then our parent object with Ctrl and left click, and finally parent it by pressing Ctrl and P. Then I'm going to select our 3D model pieces object, go into edit mode, select everything by pressing A, and then press P to separate the pieces and choose by loose parts. And there we have it. We made each piece to an individual object. Now what I want to do now is I want to group this big group of individual objects into smaller groups. More specifically, I want to group them into rows. This is because later in Unity, we are going to tweak the animation of each row individually to create this magical effect you saw in the intro. You can freely choose the number of rows you want to create, but be aware, the more rows you make, the more work you're going to have later on. I'm going to group my pieces into 3 rows. For that, I'm going to first create 3 empty objects and call them row 1, 2, and 3. And then parent the rows to my 3D model pieces parent object. And finally, I'm going to select the pieces I want to group together and parent them to the respective group. So I want the bottom row to be row 1, the middle row to be row 2, and the top row to be row 3. To do that, we're going to first align our view to the y-axis, by just going up here and select the green dot. With that, it is easier to select our rows without accidentally select parts of the other rows. Alternatively, you could have also aligned your view to the x-axis instead of the y-axis by just clicking on the red dots. Okay, next, to make it a bit easier to see all our parts, we go up here and select X-frame mode to see through our objects. And if you like, you can also choose wireframe mode to only have the edges of our parts visible. Now by clicking and dragging, we can select all the objects we want to parent to a specific row. Let's start with row 1. And you can see here that I've selected more than I wanted. So let's unselect everything we don't need by pressing Ctrl and left click on the objects until they are unselected. Okay, now that we've done that, let's select our empty row 1 object again with Ctrl and left click to make it our last selected object and let Blender know that this is going to be our parent object. And then finally, move our mouse pointer to our main view and parent all the selected pieces to row 1. Okay, now let's also do this for our middle row. Check again if you got all the parts selected that you want to group together. Then select row 2 with Ctrl and left click and parent the pieces to row 2. And finally, let's do the same for our top row. Here we can just select all the remaining pieces and parent them to row 3. And with that, we've parented all the pieces to their respective group. Now let's just return to our original viewport shading mode and disable X-ray mode. Nice, we are nearly done. Only one thing left to do before we can export our 3D models. Currently, each part of our 3D model pieces object has its center point at the bottom of the object, which is fine for the main parent object and the 3 row objects because we want them to have their center point there. But for the individual pieces we don't want that, because when we rotate them, then they will not rotate around themselves, but rather around the center point of their parent object. So to fix that, we're going to select each broken piece of our object. Then right-click, set origin and then origin to geometry. And tada! Now each broken piece has its individual center point and will behave as intended when rotated. Great! Now we can finally export our original 3D model and our broken 3D model. I'm going to export the broken version first. For that we have to select all the parts of the object. Then go to File, Export, FBX, and then here we're going to select Limit to Selected Objects, so that we only export our selected objects. Then we're going to click on Empty and Shift-click Mesh, because these are the 2 types we're going to export. Then set Forward to Z Forward, name our FBX file, and we can export our object. Now let's just do the same for our unharmed 3D model. Let's make it visible again first. And now, with only our 3D model selected, we again go to File, Export, FBX, and we only need to name it since our preferences are still there. And finally, Export. Nice! And with that, we are done with Blender. And also with part 1 of this video series. I hope you liked it so far. And if so, why not give it a thumbs up? It would really make my day. And thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you all again in part 2. Link is in the video description, or in a few seconds on screen. So until then, ciao! Heyo! You can find part 2 of this tutorial here, so feel free to check it out. And if you're interested in more tutorials, then you can check out all my tutorials here in this playlist. I'm off to part 2 now, so hope to see you all there. Bye!